Okay, I just wanted to unpack the public health policy report a little bit more for you. I have provided you with a task description, which gives you the more detailed information, which is on the screen currently. And I also have given you a set of slides, which also breaks down the requirements for the task. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background and then obviously the expectations with this, because it might be something that's quite foreign to a lot of you. And it's an important part of how we work towards in public health, trying to improve what we know statistically as a problem with physical activity and sedentary behaviour in our population. So the report is really targeted at trying to improve population health. It's not about coming up with some recommendations for people at an individual level. It's about coming up with policy recommendations at a population level. And I want to emphasise that when you come to write up your recommendations, that's really important. So I provided you with a bit of background initially to give you some idea of why policy is really important in public health. And really, it's there to make an impact at a broader community and population level rather than just individual interventions. And hopefully it becomes a lot more sustainable over time, particularly as we're in a world where things are quite, coming and going in terms of trends. So we've had a lot of really great impact in public health on a lot of areas of health. Issues like sanitation, fluoridation, drink driving, tobacco are just some examples of where policy has had quite a strong impact in bringing about societal change and the way that people feel about good habits and healthy habits. So when you think about policy, policy can include goals, interventions, measures that can be taken to improve conditions. It can be about strategies to educate. It can be about strategies to engage community. And it can be about strategies to address issues that negatively impact people's public health. So why do we write up reports? Really, it's so initially you can identify particularly at-risk populations. And at the moment, you could say that the entire population is at risk of a physical inactivity epidemic. But it does require you to draw upon evidence and research and data to be able to look at factors that are contributing to your population group. And you're obviously going to then, tie together some sort of picture of what that looks like and how it's affecting that given population. And this hopefully then helps governments and organisations to implement policies that are going to help improve that situation for that population. Now, you've got your general details regarding when this task is due. It is due in week 9, and you'll be submitting it via Turnitin in a Word document. Okay, so that's an important aspect. We're looking for a word count around 1,500 plus or minus 10%. You'll need to use APA 7th edition referencing. All right, so the purpose, you're going to put together a report using the structure that I've provided in this task description. So please don't divert from that. Please utilise that format. That's very important. You will be marked down in one of the criteria if you decide to go rogue and use your own format. We've asked for you to use the structure as is stipulated. So you're going to select one of these population groups to start with, and only one, and that's going to be your focus for the report, okay? And the idea is that you're writing a modified report following the structure I've asked, and the whole premise of it is really to write about the importance of reducing sedentary behaviour in your population group and increasing physical activity. Now, initially, you're going to talk about the general population and its diversity, and then you'll spend most of your discussion talking about the at-risk population. You must use appropriate literature, so you're going to have to take a deep dive into some research around this, and your discussion is really critiquing and analysing that research. It's not just telling us and describing what you found in the research. I can just read the research papers to find that out, but we want you to be analytical about the research that you found. If you need assistance in analytical writing, I suggest you use Studiosity or WriteWise to assist you in how to write more analytically. You'll also finish off the report with some recommendations and strategies that could be used to inform future policy. And I'm going to direct you to a number of different resources that can help you consider what recommendations might be helpful. So once you've selected your group, you'll then start your research into that population group, and you'll then structure your report. Now, first and foremost, you'll start off with an executive summary, which is sometimes what it's called, or an abstract. It's only 100 words, but it's a standalone summary of what your report is about. So I've only given suggestions here of what your abstract might look like, but it really is just an overview of what your report is about and the purpose of the report. So it might have a brief description of the issue, which is obviously sedentary behaviour. You could throw in a couple of statistics about that, perhaps, a really disturbing statistic about your population group. And then one or two maybe of your findings, okay, that you found about, maybe some social determinants that have actually contributed to the problem. And then your, overview of your recommendations. Like, you don't have to repeat every recommendation, but maybe just cast a little bit of a lens for the reader to see where you're going with your recommendations. Okay, so really it is just very much that, an overview. That comes first in your report, all right? You don't even need a cover page or anything like that. You just have your abstract on its own page as a standalone. Then in a report, each section appears on its own page, okay? So you will have a contents page. Now, please refer to the APA 7th convention for a contents page. Once again, it sits on its own page, and it should be some of the reports that I'm going to show you how to put a contents page together. So it really should look something along those lines when you have a look at your resources. Then on the next page, and once again, it is a standalone page. We don't just pack it all into one page. You'll do your introduction background, okay? Now, in some reports, these are separate, but I've decided we'll just combine these. And it's 300 words approximately, so it has a bit of meat to it. And I guess just trying to set the scene. You're trying to create a background to this public health issue of sedentary behaviour, okay? So you might consider including some of these dot points in your introduction. It does not mean you have to include all of them. It just gives you a direction of how you might provide an introduction into your report. So you might state the question or topic and why it's important. And I might come back to that in a moment when I talk to you about the things that you need to consider. Obviously, you need to make it very clear who your population group is and the scope of the problem. what the report's objective was, so what were you actually researching. So you're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of current physical activity policy in Australia or to do with your population. And then you might look at a very small overview of some of your research, but please don't go into any great detail because you're going to expand on it in the discussion. If you feel it could be helpful to identify a couple of definitions, that might be good, particularly if it's aligned to your population. And the report, as you're introducing it, you can align, most organisations or people who are writing a report try to give context as to where they're coming from. So sometimes in an introduction, they do offer up who they are and, what their purpose is. They could be a researcher, they could be an organisation, they could be advocates for a particular public health issue. Now then, that might be 150 words, okay? And then you might spend a bit more now in your background, giving a few more of these dot points. Again, the origin of the issue, what's caused this for the population? How, is there any current policy provided for that population that, helps them become more physically active? And any factors that have influenced government or community or industry in this space. So, as I said, once again, you do not have to necessarily cover all of these dot points, but I'm hoping that you're seeing what could be giving you a direction to add some details to your introduction and background. Now, really, the main part of your report, and once again, it will appear on its own separate page, is your findings and discussion. And this makes up the majority of where you're going to refer to research. Be mindful that all these other sections, like the introduction and background, should also, if you're using any evidence, you need to obviously cite it. But very importantly, you need to use your evidence, as stated here, to discuss your particular problem, which is obviously sedentary behaviour in the population that you've chosen. Now, in this section, I have said you can use subheadings if you want to, because it just might help you unpack that report a little bit more with your discussion. And again, we want to see you tie in some of these dot points. So obviously, this is where you get to go into a lot more detail, what the research says about the extent and the impact of sedentary behaviour in your population, and any studies that have been conducted on that population, any policy reports that perhaps you can lay your hands on, or any policy that affects that population currently. And, you may even want to talk about whether it's been effective or not. So you might, be able to find a case study or, something as an example that you can draw upon. So for instance, if you're targeting a school-aged population, then maybe you're going to be able to look at an example of policy that's already been implemented in the education system. And is it actually being effective? Are we seeing kids or not in your population group being more physically active? You could use tables or graphs. I wouldn't go too heavy-handed on that. If you want to be able to highlight a particular, as you can see in the table or as you can see in the graph, we've had, a steep decline of physical activity since, whatever date. And I think, when we're talking about stakeholders or interest groups, it's usually, organisations like, obviously sporting organisations and recreational organisations and communities that may end up being stakeholders in this. And I'll show you that when we refer to a few of the examples. Once you've done a really deep dive and a good discussion and you've pulled apart a lot of literature, you can then do your final conclusion. Again, it appears on its own separate page, 100 words roughly, just giving a final overview, summarising what you've discussed in the report. That comes before the recommendations. When you get to the recommendations, they'll be once again on a page on their own, and you'll be looking to, this also makes up a large percentage of your report. So your recommendations are to be written up in numbered form. And I would be suggesting you provide at least 4 recommendations for your population group, okay? And we're looking at things that policy should be addressing in the future, okay, as your recommendations. These also have to be evidenced. You have to be able to indicate that you're not just making them up in your head. You have to indicate that, where you've cited those recommendations, and you're not just cutting and pasting a recommendation from a document. You're going to have to, talk about these things about, the benefits, the risks, the likelihood of success. You might say what the policy is, recommendation is, but then you need to expand upon it a bit more, okay? Because these are your, changes that you want to see happen. You want to see change that's going to be a bit more impactful to the population, rather than, things that probably already exist and we're not seeing perhaps a lot of change. Reference list, okay, please follow APA 7 formatting for referencing. There is a referencing guide on iLearn to assist you with correct APA. And again, make sure that you are citing throughout the report. Now, what I want you to refer to, that's the structure, okay? And there's some things to consider to perhaps think about putting into your report. But these are the things that you must do and must consider for the different sections, okay? So we've got an overarching research question, particularly for your discussion section, which you need to that's the lens you're coming from. And that is why it's important to develop effective policies and strategies that reduce sedentary behaviour and promote physical activity, particularly for Australia's diverse population and particularly targeting your at-risk group, whatever that risk group is. What recommendations can be made for improvement in policy and strategies? So in your response, in your discussion, when you're drawing upon all your evidence and research, you need to keep that research question in the back of your, in your mind as to how you will go about discussing your population group. So in essence, your discussion is addressing that question, okay? Obviously, you have to use literature to be able to discuss your findings, with a minimum of 5 sources to be used, and 3 of these must be peer reviewed, okay? And you can use some grey literature, all right? I've given you a link to have a look at what grey literature is, but it's things like the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, Australian Bureau of Statistics, World Health Organization, those sort of databases, but only 1 or 2 to draw upon there. So in more specifically your discussion section, obviously you need to, when you're answering this question, you need to keep in mind these 2 dot points. So you're critiquing the impact that sedentary behaviour has on the physical and the mental health of the diverse Australian population, and then honing in more specifically on your chosen population group, okay? And then demonstrate how physical activity is important for physical and mental health. So it's really important that you're tying in the mental health element as well as the physical, okay? So it's a 2-pronged approach because you're looking at the diverse population that we have in Australia. You need to show that you've got some understanding about how sedentary behaviour is creeping into the diversity of our population. And then obviously you'll talk a little bit more specifically to your particular population group, all right? Then you do need to think about existing policy guidelines, frameworks that already exist in place to help populations become more physically active. If you don't go there, then we can't give you marks for that. Okay, so in your discussion, if you haven't addressed some sort of policy that exists currently, then really that you won't get the marks for that. So you do need to show some depth of understanding that we do have policy in place, we do have guidelines, we do have frameworks, but are they working? Could it be better? And this is where you go to in your recommendations. So in the recommendations section, obviously, once again, you're using literature to come up with your 4 or 5, however many you want to, recommendations. And it needs to come from a whole health systems population approach, okay, to improve physical activity levels. So it's not just about, I'll write up somebody a 6-week program. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that's going to bring about change in population, okay, and particularly the population group that you've chosen, all right? So you might want to have a look at what whole systems looks like. I've gone into that in the lecture, so it's probably pretty important that you've watched the lecture so that you do have an understanding of that. And that's, in a moment, I'm going to show you what that can look like, okay? So you're going to do that by looking at existing policy and different reports that have been written and some of the, obviously resources that I've given you. And one of my very strong resources that I recommend that you look at is the Getting Active Australia 3 resource. And I'm going to refer to that in a minute, particularly to inform your whole systems health approach, okay? So that's just some really important things for you to consider when you're starting to do this. I don't want you to get confused by what you're putting into the introduction in the background. The premise obviously is about the findings and the discussions and the recommendations. That's where the real workout comes in. That's where the real analysis comes in. And you need to be able to keep this overarching question to give you direction in how to write your discussion. Okay, that's the purpose of this overarching question. So just again, keep that in mind. You need to see that you're addressing both how sedentary behaviour affects physical health and mental health. Okay. All right, as always, I always suggest students should look at the rubric. You are getting some marks for how you've presented your introduction, your abstract and conclusion, marks for the quality of the evidence that you're providing, and obviously the big marks come into your findings, discussion, recommendations and strategies, and always there'll be marks given for the way you write, the structure, your citations, your referencing, and your overall general ease of read for the reader. Okay, so that's that. And I'd just like to refer you to the iLearn site so I can show you what I'm talking about in terms of some of the resources. So when you go into iLearn in week 6 and in week 7, I have provided you with some additional tasks and resources, and I think it's really important that you have a look at these. So this is your Getting Australia Active 3. I've suggested where to go to have a look at some policy domains for action. So this is a document which has been put together by a number of different partnerships, but they are really important for you to look at policy recommendations, okay? They've tackled the policy recommendations in these particular areas. So this is a systems approach, a whole systems approach, because we're looking at not just trying to educate people. We're trying to tackle obesity and sedentary behaviour from all of these areas, all of these domains, okay? So you might decide that you're more interested in looking at policy in sport and recreation domain or in education, but perhaps the group that you've decided to spend your population on is more workplace-related domain or community. So it's really important to go into this document, and it would be surprising to me if you don't jump in there and have a look at each of these different domains and see what policy recommendations there are, okay? The other one is if, again, your population group is a youth targeted group, I would have a look at page 14 of this document in particular to look at some of the policy recommendations. The reason I'm suggesting these resources is so that you can see what a policy recommendation looks like, okay? So that's the important thing. Another one to look at is the National Health Preventative Strategy. Again, look at page 57 for some policy achievements that the New South Wales government want to do by 2030. So that in itself gives you, they've already come up with some targets, but you might want to be able to pick 1 or 2 of their targets and actually be a little bit more specific about what that could look like for your target population, okay? So these hopefully will be helpful for you to get an idea of what recommendations you're making. A call to action supporting Australians to move more. Have a look at the Australian Physical Activity Alliance's 6 key policy priorities that would set Australia on the path of being more physically active. So again, these are going to be very general. So you need to be able to look at them and think, okay, I need to think of things based on evidence that I've looked at of what would be more specific for my population group. Okay, so that again is very important. There's also some other additional ones I've put in there that may also be helpful. Okay, so that's in week 6 of the resources, and I would strongly suggest that you have a look at some of these resources to help inform you when you're coming to think about recommendations. Also in week 7, this is where we talk about the systems-based approach to physical activity, okay? And once again, there's some examples of what sports, is happening in sport and what they're hoping to achieve through policy, to improve people's physical activity levels. So it's really, really important that you take a deep dive into some of these resources that I have offered to you so that it can help you when you're writing up your recommendations, okay? So I'm going to finish up there now. If you do have any further questions between now and the time that it is due, please post them on the discussion forum so that all students can benefit from the responses that I'll be giving. But I hope this has helped a little bit more.